okay, I know this was a different time and everything, and I really tried to keep that in mind as the Bible refers to slavery all over the place. And not only does it not say it's wrong, I mean, the Bible gives you advice about how you're supposed to keep your slaves and how slaves should behave obediently at all times to their masters. But I don't know, I guess I sort of thought the Son of God would say slavery was wrong. But no, Jesus does not say that. In fact, he uses slavery as an example of how God treats people. It was really hard to stay on Jesus' side when he started saying really aggressive, just hateful things. Like in Luke chapter 21, Jesus says that he is like a king who says, anyone who does not recognize me, bring them here and slaughter them before me. Or in John chapter 15, Jesus says, anyone who does not believe in me is like a withered branch that will be cast into the fire and burned. In Matthew, he says, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. And in Luke, he says, and if you don't have a sword, sell your clothes and buy one. Then Jesus just starts acting downright crazy. Like in Matthew chapter 21, when this fig tree doesn't have a fig for Jesus to eat, he condemns the fig tree to death. That's right, Jesus condemns a fig tree to death. Not a parable, by the way, just Jesus pissed off that the fig tree didn't have a fig for him to eat when he wanted one. Not exactly the Prince of Peace who taught us to turn the other cheek. And then there's family. I have to say that for me, the most deeply upsetting thing about Jesus is his family values, which is amazing when you think how there's so many groups out there who say they base their family values on the Bible. I mean, he seems to have no real close ties to his parents. He puts his mother off cruelly over and over again. At the wedding feast, he says to her, woman, what have I to do with you? And once, while he was speaking to a crowd, Mary waited patiently off to the side to talk to him, and Jesus said to the disciples, send her away, because you are my family now. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell this exact same story, but Mark actually tells us why Mary was there to see Jesus. He says Mary came to see Jesus to restrain him, because the people were saying he's gone out of his mind. I kept thinking, yes, let's go get Jesus and get him some help. Anyway, Jesus discourages any contact his converts have with their own families. He himself does not marry or have children, and he explicitly tells his followers not to have families as well, and if they do, they should just abandon them. Now, mostly Jesus says this because he believed the end of all time was imminent. Jesus said over and over again that the people who were alive when he was alive would not die naturally, but see the end times. He tells us this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, okay, Jesus tells us not to have families because he mistakenly believed that the end of all time was imminent, but then he tells us not to take care of the families that we do have already. Like in Luke chapter 14, Jesus says, anyone who comes to me and does not hate father and mother, brothers and sisters, wife and children, cannot be my disciple. I mean, isn't that what cults do? Get you to reject your family in order to inculcate you? So that's the New Testament family values for you, the supposed big improvement over the Old Testament family values, which seem to me to be mostly about incest and mass slaughter and protecting your own specific genetic line at all costs. After the Gospels, there's a bunch of letters written by the early Christians, the most important of which are written by St. Paul. Now, the Bible's view of women is dreadful in general. And, I know this was a different time and everything. But St. Paul, man, he really just gets right to the point. St. Paul writes, man is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or have any authority over a man. She must be silent. If there is anything a woman desires to know, let her ask her husband at home. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve. And it was not the man who was deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became the sinner. The Bible, the good book, the good news. I was so disillusioned with the Bible, by the time I finished the epistles, I just didn't think it could get any worse. But it did. We were just about to read the last and most oddball book of the Bible, Revelation. Now, apparently, Revelation was written by St. John, the same person who wrote a gospel and some of the epistles. The biblical historian Ken Smith says that if his epistles can be seen as John on pot, Well, Revelation is John on acid. It describes the end of days with a little too much gruesome enthusiasm. Revelation tells us that in heaven there is a throne, and the one who sat there had the appearance of a jasper. Around the throne are 4 living creatures, and they're covered with eyes, front and back. Day and night, they never stop saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." In heaven, Jesus resembles a dead lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes. And when the gates of hell are open, locusts pour out with human faces wearing tiny crowns, and they sting people with their tails. Revelation tells us that only 144,000 people will be saved and even get into heaven, and that none of them will have, quote, defiled themselves with women. Which I guess excludes most heterosexual men from heaven. And depending on how you interpret that word defiled, I don't know, I would say it excludes all women, too. After we finished Revelation, the entire Bible study group sat there, dumbfounded, our Bibles on our laps. Father Tom said, Revelation's a poem about the end of the world? I said, Father Tom, I am having a really hard time with this book. And he told me to pray for faith. I left the church thinking, is this one big practical joke? Where is my God, the Jesus I know, the one that I love, and the one who loves me? I was driving home and I was stopped at a red light on Crenshaw and Wilshire, and it was a Sunday, and all these people were walking to church holding their Bibles, and I wanted to roll down the window and say, have you read that book? Really? I felt like I was in a horror film, and the clue to the insanity was not some secret document. It was a book that everyone was holding, that was on every coffee table, the biggest bestseller of all time, the key to the underpinnings of the faith, in every single hotel room in the land. And yet, if you cared enough to just glance inside, you found you'd open the door to an insane asylum with a bunch of crazy people dancing around saying, yippity, yippity, yeah! And now I'd shut that door, and how could I pretend that I hadn't opened that door? My mother said, Julie, I just ignore what I don't like. Why would you do something, honey, like go read the Bible cover to cover if you weren't just looking for reasons to get upset? You make your life so much harder than it has to be, honey. Well, I went to Book Soup, and I wandered around, and I saw this book called The History of God by this woman, Karen Armstrong. Karen Armstrong is this amazing British religious writer who was a nun for 7 years, and then she left the convent, and now I believe she teaches religious history at a rabbinical institute in England. In my mind, the Haley Mills character in The Trouble with Angels, well, she grows up to become Karen Armstrong. Karen has all sorts of scathingly brilliant ideas. I loved The History of God, and in it, Karen makes a good point. She says the stories of the Bible are not literally true. Everybody knows they're not literally true, and it's not even important that they're true. What's important is that they're psychologically true. And that was a big revelation for me. I felt like I finally understood. As if at long last I was in on the secret. I thought, oh yeah, that's what everybody already knows, only no one says it. Or maybe this is what Father Tom was trying to tell me when he said myth-ish. He meant it was psychologically true. I walked around thinking, of course. And I remember the nuns teaching me dogma in grade school and how exasperated they would get if I asked too many questions. And now I knew what they were thinking. They were thinking, don't you know it's just psychologically true? Everybody else seems to get that. So when I went to Mass on Easter Sunday that year, I felt I had this new positive attitude. I knew the correct way to look at the stories. Historical accuracy was not important. That people built cultures around them wasn't even important. What was important was that they triggered us somehow very deep in our psyche because they were psychologically true. But as I sat there in Mass, I thought, what does that really mean, psychologically? Jesus' death and resurrection, death and rebirth, okay, I get it. Psychologically true enough. But what about other stories?